Hey, y'all. Okay. Raw Reflections. I'm Keaton Wyndham. We are going on a journey where I, as a conservative Southern Christian, am taking graduate level courses to get a master's in sexual health from a liberal university in a liberal state. And so I'm just kind of breaking down my learning experience here. Um, my last video is the week 2 assignment kind of breakdown, although I am not totally sure whether or not I am going to leave that as private or not. I have to review it a few times before I am for sure. So that may not be the last video that you guys have seen on my YouTube, um, but I'll keep you posted on that. Today we are talking about my week 3 class reflection. In week 3, the topic that we covered was ethics. And ethics seems like a rather boring, like dry topic. To be real honest, I was preparing myself to like drag through and be super bored. And I was kind of getting disappointed in the class. I was thinking, oh, it's only week 3. Like, the first 2 weeks were so fun and so exciting, and now we're like pumping the brakes real hard with ethics. Um, but it actually ended up being an awesome week. I was totally unprepared for how much I was going to enjoy it. So I read a few interesting things, I guess you would say, this week for our required reading. This class, and from what I kind of understand, the program overall is pretty like reading intensive. Lots of research and like journal articles and stuff. Um, and so one of the things that we were supposed to read was a chapter. I think the book, I wasn't totally sure on whether the book was called this or if it was the title of the chapter, because telling I did not do well. I like read 7 out of the 10 required pages, and then I just couldn't. I couldn't anymore. It was something called Talking Trans, and it said that it was just about basic vocabulary and terms to use with the trans community. And I was like, okay, so like that's not my vibe. But if it's just basic terms and vocabulary, I feel like I know the basic terms. So like maybe this won't be that bad. It like felt very blatantly like indoctrination. Like I could not, like I said, I think the chapter from the book was like 10 pages and I made it to 7 and I just could not. I tried I think 2 or 3 times to pick up that particular reading and go through it, and I couldn't do it. like I can normally filter through and like prepare myself like, okay, this is what I'm going to expect. That like we can trudge through. And so like for me to have gotten to the point where I couldn't take anymore, like for people that know me, they know that was a lot for me to come to the end of my limit. Um, but at least I tried, you know? I always try to give an effort to like understand what people are trying to communicate. Um, Another thing that we reviewed was the AASECT Code of Conduct. AASECT is an acronym. It's AASE, no, yeah, AASECT. There we go. It's the American Association of sex educators, counselors, and therapists. Sorry, I don't normally have to think that hard. Um, and that is what a lot of people, after going through portions of this degree or the entire degree, that's normally kind of the certification they seek next. I'm not sold one way or the other whether or not I am going to go through with that, just because that is one more thing to keep up with, like the hours and the training for. And I will be busy enough trying to keep up with my LPC, like hours and stuff for my licensure. Um, and there probably isn't a huge call for it in my area. So I might at a later time consider doing it. It might be really cool. Um, but for now, that's on the back burner. But we went over their code of conduct. Um, for a mental health professional, I already subscribe to an ethics board for school counseling, and I have an ethics board for my license for chemical dependency. And I have already gone through and had to study for my licensed professional counselor test for the clinical ethics. And so I am ethicsed out. The ASECT Code of Conduct really just said, where sex specifically is concerned, whether it be sex education or sex therapy. And a lot of it had to do with, like, whether or not certain behaviors were appropriate or inappropriate with a client. Um, and so it wasn't anything really new or enlightening. Um, but there was one article that was awesome. It was called Becoming Kink Aware. It had a much longer name in totality, but it was a published article in the Sexual Relationships and Therapy journal, like a scientific journal. Um, Full of research that they have compiled, and it was really good. It was about how therapists can no longer afford to not be kink aware. And as squeamish as people can be about sex, they seem to be even more squeamish about the concept of like kinks and BDSM. And so um, I for one, uh, just because of the research that I've had to do independently, feel like the things to be considered kink aware versus kink friendly, I am already doing. Um, and a lot of like super conservative people treat sex as kind of like a no-go zone for conversation, so they definitely don't talk about kinks. Um, but I'm going to read y'all a portion of what this research article said. I've got my two prime pages. So it basically says that the mainstream acceptance of BDSM is conditional and rests on the expectation that it eventually will blend into rigid sexual norms set by society. So, like, people are open to BDSM as long as it finds its way back to the expectations of society, which is wild. Um, and that the concept of vanilla sex has shrunk from describing normal, like normal sexuality, to referencing only, quote, sexual activities typically associated with bland heterosexuality that seem inherently unadventurous and unsatisfying. And I can say firsthand, I have definitely seen that. Vanilla sex, that term, is used more primarily by the kink and BDSM community to describe, originally, to describe people who are having sex that does not involve kink, BDSM, fetishes, etc. But now the term vanilla sex is actually more commonly used to reference boring sex. So it went from just like a differentiator to now like a full on put down. And I have heard people use it that way, which is hilarious that they included that in research. But so people see BDSM and kink as like a super taboo element, and they think that people who are deviant or that have something mentally or emotionally wrong with them are the ones that are engaging in it. And so they actually had a whole section of the research dedicated to depathologizing the concept of kink and BDSM. And so I want to read some of that to y'all too. It says participants of BDSM were no more likely than non participants to have been subjected to sexual coercion in the past, did not score higher on a scale of psychological distress, and were no more likely to suffer from sexual difficulty, such as lack of interest in sex or reaching orgasm. And then sadomasochists had attained higher levels of education, had higher incomes, and were more likely to work in white-collar occupations. Sadomasochists held prominent positions at work and were involved in community service compared to non-BDSM participants. It supports the idea that they are socially well-functioning. Women, specifically in the kink community, were more likely than women outside the kink community to be better educated and satisfied with their sex lives and sexual orientation. And then let's see. Practitioners of BDSM were more extroverted, open to new experiences, less neurotic, less sensitive to rejection, and more securely attached. And that's referencing like attachment theory, secure, anxious, avoidant attachment theories. Attachment theories are super cool to look into. Highly recommend. Let's see. Scores of their subjective well-being were also higher than those in the control group, which is the non-kinky people. And so due to the level that was due to the level of consent and trust involved in most BDSM practices. Those engaged in kinky behaviors may be more self-aware, better at communicating needs, desires, and boundaries, and are open to taking more risks. And that I absolutely would agree with. Excuse you, chapstick. I have actually had conversations with my husband about how if I were to see a couple experiencing some kind of sexual dysfunction or like relationship issue, one thing that I think the BDSM or like kink community does really well is they communicate so well before they even start to lay a hand on each other. They talk things out to an insane degree. They know that what they're doing could be potentially risky, either physically, mentally, or emotionally. And so they have these huge checklists, these yes, no, maybe lists, and they walk through with their partner before they ever put themselves anywhere near a situation where they go through like line by line of specific acts and they say, are you okay with this? Are you okay with this? What about this? And there are boxes for, yes, I'm okay with this. I'm not sure. I've never done it. I don't know enough about it. So like maybe, or like in maybe in the right situation or context. I don't know. Let's circle back. Or then no, I know I don't like it. It doesn't matter the context. It doesn't matter the reason why. I'm not comfortable with it. And if one of the people is uncomfortable with it, then neither of them engage in it. And I think that kind of open and honest communication helps a couple be more comfortable with sex, and it encourages them to share their needs, and it creates deeper intimacy. And I think I've shared in one of my previous videos that sex and relationships are so closely intertwined that, like, if you have bad sex as like a married couple, then that will cause stress in your relationship. And if your relationship is not doing well, it's definitely going to affect your sex life. And so um, I really think that that tool and that process that the kink community utilizes is so great that I would want to utilize that with my clients. Sorry, it does not matter that school has been out for hours. The bells are still on because my office is out of school. Um, okay, the final thing in this becoming kink aware as like a mental health professional or like a sex educator said that I thought was super interesting was that there are healing narratives of BDSM using plots from television, movies, and books. However, they cautioned readers that the concept of healing narratives, when applied to BDSM, may reiterate the misconception that all BDSM practitioners are psychologically damaged and are engaging in BDSM to address their problems. And I will say, I have seen that. Um, Even probably the most popular reference that people would get would be 50 Shades of Grey. Um, the male main character has a lot of like relationship and psychological and emotional issues, and the only way he can engage in like a sexually satisfying relationship or encounter is through kink and BDSM. Um, that is super untrue. That's a terrible concept. There are people who experience trauma who engage in BDSM and kinks because of the nature of control and the level of consent, and it's just a safer way for them to engage. But I will say that I have seen and read and heard from tons of members of the community that absolutely hate 50 Shades of Grey. They think it is wildly inappropriate and it misconstrues that whole community. Like, if people like the 50 Shades of Grey like movie and book series, then they are more than likely not tied to that community, um, because they don't like things like the fact that they kind of just throw all of the consent and the boundaries and things like that out the window. Like, they introduce them and then they don't at all do them, and that is not something that they engage in typically. So that was such a good article that I actually saved it in my Google Drive. Like, I have a folder of materials that I like save for when I'm a professional one day, hopefully. So I really loved that. Um, the discussion board was talking about, because we read over the AASECT Code of Conduct, and like we could compare it to our own ethics boards if we were also mental health professionals, because that's a pretty like common overlap. Um, we were supposed to discuss where we thought, let's see, goodness gracious, um, an issue that we could foresee having ethically to do with the concepts I chose were um, the concept of the dual role of a therapist. And if a client were to perceive my personal values influencing my role as a therapist. Um, Ideally, ethically, you are not supposed to serve a dual role as a therapist. Like, I cannot be any of my friends or family's therapist, because I am not unbiased. Um, I cannot be like, if I know somebody at my church, like ideally, that I'm friends with, or the like we're in a Sunday school class together and I know them like that. Like, I'm really good friends with my hairdresser. I couldn't be her therapist. She can ask me opinions on things, but like if she were to make an appointment with me, like I've known her since I was so young that it probably wouldn't be ethically appropriate. Her kids have come over to my house before when she's cut my baby's hair, and um, so like I could maybe see her kids for therapy because I don't know them very well. Um, but the closer you are to someone outside of a therapeutic setting, the less likely it is appropriate ethically to see them in counseling. And so that's all well and good in a big city, but especially if I'm wanting to be a sex therapist um, in a small town where, like, I am definitely the only female sex therapist in my area for like 2.5 hours. Um, so, I mean, if people would want sex therapy, I am the only option, whether they know me or not. And while I feel like I could compartmentalize, that could very easily get ethically a little sketchy, um, especially in all of these like smaller communities that make up the larger area. Because in smaller communities, if you are not from one, um, they don't really let you in until they are convinced that you are like a safe person. Like, they very much have this like us versus them, outsiders versus insiders type of thing. I have worked with these small communities in their school settings for 4 years now, and only within like the last 2.5 years have some of these communities really started treating me like I wasn't an outsider. And so, I mean, they may come to me based on the fact that they know me from somewhere other than being their therapist. And unfortunately, like, that is just something that you have to deal with as a like smaller community therapist. Um, and honestly, if you are the type of person that can't compartmentalize, then that would be sticky for you. But working in schools and confidentiality and things like that, um, I run into situations all the time where, I'll see kids that I have in therapy, like at their school or whatever, and I'm not pulling them for therapy. They're like passing me in the hallway, and like I may like give them a nod or something real subtle, but I don't ever put them in a position where I'm like, "Hi, friend." And someone that they're walking down the hallway with, I know would go, uh, dude, girl, whoever, who was that lady? I and then they would have to be like, I don't know her. Like, and that's obviously a lie. And that would look really sketchy. And they would feel really uncomfortable. Or some of my younger friends go, oh, that's my therapist. Even when I don't say hi, they're like, oh, that's my therapist. And I'm like, settle down. Like, you don't need to shout that from the rooftops, friend. But I am already used to having to like pretend like I don't know people when I'm out and about. Um, if if kids or people approach me, then that's one thing. But I already am kind of used to kind of, putting on, I call them putting on different hats and playing different roles for my job. Another issue that I could foresee would be the influence of like my personal values and beliefs. Someone could perceive that I am letting my personal values and beliefs like influence how I treat them therapeutically. And I I have had to kind of navigate those kinds of sticky situations before. And here's the thing, ethically, we cannot show bias towards anyone due to, the classics like race, religion, um, like cultural background, gender identity, things like that. Like all of the classic like American federal laws and regulations. However, in the Counseling Board of Ethics, there is a process for referral if you are not a good fit for a client. And sometimes you are just not a good fit, and there is nothing you can do about that. I, as a 33-year-old heterosexual married woman, am not going to understand the experience of a 70-year-old African American man who has been widowed. Yeah, yeah. Widow word. Who has lost their spouse. Because I don't understand what it feels like to experience like Black culture, Black community, and so he may decide, this fake client that I just described, he may decide like, hey, we're not a good fit, like we don't have the same experiences based on the problem that has brought me into counseling. And so he can say, I don't think we're a good fit. Like, could you help me find someone else? And I am ethically bound to help him find someone else to the best of my abilities. Just like how if I notice it before the client notices it, like if they are coming in with a problem that should best be treated with like a specific type of therapy that I don't practice, then it is my ethical responsibility to say, hey, like I understand what you're going through, and I do think you should see a therapist, but I want to go ahead and let you know that there is a specific type of therapy that would do really well for what you're coming in for. And there are other people that practice it that I can try to get you connected to. However, I myself do not practice it. Therefore, I don't think it would be beneficial for you to continue with me. And so sometimes it's situations like that. So the ethics board leaves kind of a loophole because therapy is so personalized. Like, you are a stranger going to another stranger, and you're expected to pour out your deepest, darkest secrets and trauma, and like you're really cracking yourself open for a stranger. And like saying, please help me figure out how to put myself back together. And so you have to personality wise, like, fit with that person. And if you can't get to a place where you're comfortable, then it's not going to work. um, Unfortunately, some people misuse that as a way to discriminate. And um, I, as a Christian who is a counselor, have come into contact with teens and with kids who will straight up communicate to me like, I'm agnostic, I don't believe in God, or like I believe in. I had a teenager one time tell me that they believed in like the Norse gods and like the pantheon. So like Zeus, Poseidon, Dionysus, things like that. And I was like, okay. Um, I mean, if you want to describe that to me so that I can have an understanding, I am all ears. Um, but like, if he wanted that super integrated into his therapy, I would not be the person. I mean, that's not what we were meeting for. It didn't have anything to do with anything. He just was explaining it to me one day. Um, but if he would have wanted that super integrated into the therapy he was receiving, then I would not have been the person for him. And me having the goal of being a sex therapist, I am a little bit worried that because I'm a conservative Christian, there will be more like liberal people who will come to me seeking a sex therapist, but then having a problem with the fact that I'm a conservative Christian, because I don't plan to hide that. I feel like I have been very clear on my end that like I feel like I can hold those things in tension. But if other people have a problem with it, they don't have to see me. But that makes it really hard for, I mean, clients naturally, because I would be the only option in town. So like if they were seeking my expertise but had a problem with me specifically, I mean, unfortunately it is what it is. I would I think what I would do in that situation if I noticed it was becoming a problem would be to recommend them to like a telehealth service for, like a sex therapist in one of the larger cities nearby. But, some people prefer in person therapy over telehealth therapy. I am one of those people. Like, if I was going to go to regular therapy, I would prefer in person just because I am old school like that. And I have never had to provide telehealth therapy services, but I think even as a provider, my preference would be in person because nonverbal communication is 90% of communication. Um, there's only so much nonverbal communication you can get from, the clavicle or shoulders up. And the rest of your body talks just as much as like this area does. And I don't like to stack the deck against me like that. Um, and so that is kind of what I discussed in my discussion board. The two people in my class who I responded to, one was talking about having an HIV positive client. And apparently, in the state she is from, she is not a required or like a mandated reporter. And so she went off on this like descriptive tangent in her discussion board about how like it's not her business. She wouldn't tell anyone if this person was going around and having sexual intercourse with people and not disclosing that they were HIV positive. And so I took that time to say, wow, thank you for sharing. I did not know that that was true in your state. In my state, um, if someone is going around not disclosing having an STI or an STD or HIV or AIDS, um, then that is actually a criminal offense. And I am obligated to report it. Um, and I probably would feel out the client first and be like, oh, so did you disclose to your partner? Oh, okay, you didn't. Why is that? Um, and if I had someone coming to me who had recently received that news that they had HIV or AIDS, I would go out of my way to say, okay, well, then we need to pause here to discuss the fact that in the state of Texas, you are required to disclose. If you know you have this and you do not disclose to someone well before um, a sexual encounter where they could contract HIV or AIDS, then you could be put in prison for years. You could be fined thousands of dollars. In the state of Texas, they can consider it like assault. They can consider it assault with a deadly weapon, the weapon being the virus, or aggravated assault, too, I think was another description. I even saw that it has the potential for someone to be charged with attempted murder, and I think the maximum sentence is like 25 years in jail and like $10,000. So like Texas does not. Um, but I said, this just highlights the importance of knowing your state's laws and like how we are ethically bound in comparison to the state laws, because if we are not following the laws of the state in which we are practicing and representing, then we are not behaving ethically, in my opinion. um, and then we also talked about understanding confidentiality and informed consent. And I just kind of described that, I work with kids kindergarten to 12th grade, and I always try to make sure to describe the concept of confidentiality in an age appropriate manner. For younger kids, I definitely talk about the difference between confidentiality and a secret. Like we're not keeping a secret here in therapy. Confidentiality is different. If you give me permission to tell somebody something, then I will tell them. If you are a danger to yourself or others, or someone is a danger to you, then I will be telling someone to keep you safe, because that is my job, to keep you safe. Um, but you can tell whoever you want about what we talk about in therapy whenever you want. Okay? Like, you don't have to keep a single thing that we talk about secret, because we don't keep secrets in therapy. Confidentiality is part of my job. And then for like my middle school and high school kids, sometimes when I'm like, oh, okay, do you know what confidentiality is? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, great. Well, just in case, here's what I mean when I say it. Now, real quick, just to make sure you're paying attention, can you repeat that back to me, like in your own words? What does it mean? And I'm glad I do that, because they play. They don't typically know what it means. Um, let's see. And then in another one, uh, it wasn't much different than my own original discussion board, but I really just talked about how there are a lot of therapists who are actually biased against kink and BDSM practices because they don't think it's mentally healthy. And it's typically older therapists, because typically the fresher you are out of school, like the more updated information you have. And when you get out of school and you're not held to such like a rigorous standard of like staying up to date and on top of research, you typically are not being as up to date as you typically would. Kind of the further you get out of being of school, like the slower you are to like update your information that you use. And which is definitely true. I have done that myself before. But so then I just talked about how I used like a personal story talking about how like my husband and I have had conversations about how kink is in the eye of the beholder. When I remember when I first started learning about it years ago, my husband was like, I am so vanilla. And I'm like, like you don't have any information on the subject. I wouldn't declare yourself things, because most people, when they think of kink and BDSM, they think like whips and chains and handcuffs and like leather everywhere. And I said it's really funny. Like kink has like a spectrum to it, and it can sometimes, like, kink is as little as like putting like a mask or a cover over your eyes, or like wearing earplugs, like it. So like it's been funny to see like how the more conservative someone is, um, the like wilder they think the behaviors have to be considered kinky. But like the people who will actually sit and listen to what makes kink and BDSM like mentally and like practically happen, and kind of like the mindset that goes along with it. What one person considers a kink, another person just considers like their standard run of the mill sexual behavior. And it has been really funny when people ask me to describe certain kinks. It's like when you walk up to a stand-up comedian and you're like, "Oh, you're a comedian? Tell me a joke. If you're funny for a living, be funny right now." So sometimes when people hear that I'm like kink aware, they're like, "Oh, you know about kink? Tell me about kink right now. Tell me a fact." And I'm just like, "Okay, well, what do you think it is?" And based on what they think it is, I'm like, well, let me take it from what you're saying. Let me take it a step down. If you think it's handcuffs, I'm here to tell you that closing your eyes and like sight deprivation can be considered a kink to some people. And sometimes they get a little like weirded out and like crazy. So that's always really funny to see. The very last thing, I guess I'll like briefly run over my topic proposal. The assignment this week was to propose 3 potential topics for a presentation we're going to have to give. That's like our final project. And so the 3 topics that I chose for like potential presentation were the effects of ADHD and sex, the effects of autism and sex, and how to make evangelical parents more open to sex education. And so that is all I will say about that, because 2 of them aren't even worth talking about. Because I have, from those 3, next week I will have to settle on one, but I had to submit 3 potential topics to talk about. But I'll go into that more next week. Um, the last thing was the current event journal, which, like I've said previously, it's where I pick an article that has been printed in the last year that is speaking about the topic that we have been covering in class. And so I was like, oh no, ethics and porn, or ethics and sex, not porn, ethics and sex. Um, I am not even going to begin to look that up anywhere near my school Wi-Fi, um, just because I don't know what's going to pop up. Like when I go search for an article for these assignments every week, it's like uh, sex article and then whatever the topic was for the week. So I typed in at my own home sex, current event, uh, ethics. And what came up was actually a women's health article, the Women's Health magazine, There was actually a magazine article within this past year, I think it was June of 2024, that talked about ethical porn. And I was like, ugh, I don't really want to write about this. Like, I don't condone porn. As somebody who has their addictions license, like I know, and my final project in my addictions coursework when I took an addictions class was about how detrimental porn was to marriages and relationships. And so I didn't really want to write about it, but like I could not find a single article like about that fit the criteria that like covered ethics and sex. And so I really kind of that was all I had to work with. I would love to see what articles my classmates came up with. Um, but they were talking about ethical porn, and as somebody who like has independently researched sex for years, I was prepared and like already assuming what is he, my husband calls it something, my implicit bias, there we go, uh, already had me thinking, gosh, I bet when they say ethical porn, they mean feminist porn, which is a concept that I have like come across in my studies of like sex education and sexual health, um, because one of the really detrimental things about porn, aside from the addiction, is that it shows a more like misogynistic, like violent version of sex that is not very realistic, and it teaches boys who like try to learn about sex using porn. It teaches them that like this violence is the norm. This is how sex works. This is how you do it. And they also discussed something about like the male gaze, which means porn is traditionally filmed and created and written and shot with the camera, um, based on what men are interested in and into. And so that's what I was prepared for it to discuss. But I was kind of pleasantly surprised, because when they meant ethical porn, they actually started off by talking about the business side of it, and talked about how detrimental the free porn websites were because um, they are stealing episodes, clips. I don't know how to describe whatever porn is. I'm not a consumer. Um, they talk about the how they rip it off of paid sites and then put it out there for free, and how that is essentially like stealing money from the companies, from the actors, from the producers, and all of these people who are working ethically from like an appropriate business model. And so you should not utilize unpaid site and consume free content. And I was like, I didn't know that. Interesting. And they also talked about the desire to pay actors appropriately, and living wages, and how ethical porn like allows the actors and actresses to really take control and like have a huge say in the content that they create. And they actually praised the OnlyFans site for being a direct like creator to consumer site, because it gives the creator tons and tons of control, and it gets the money that the consumer pays and give it straight to the creator. And so like I was like, oh, okay, I understand what they are saying. But then they did kind of tie it into like the whole feminist porn movement. Just because they also talked about trying to make it more like realistic, less like pizza guy, like 70s corny scenario, and it looking more like realistic in the sense of like the chemistry and like how a typical like normal couple would have sex. But the thing is that they're on paid sites, and the critique that I gave them in my analysis of the article is that they were saying, they want young people to see what it's realistically supposed to be like and not have this poor interpretation. And I was saying, like kids are getting a hold of it younger and younger. What 13-year-old, heck, what like 16-year-old even has. I mean, I was 18 years old, and my dad's name I think is still on my bank account because it's my original bank account. But these kids don't have enough money to pay for porn. I assume. I don't know how much porn costs, but like putting it behind a paywall, I understand what they're trying to do, like from an ethical business model perspective. But like to throw in that argument, it didn't feel very fleshed out, if that makes sense. Because the people they say they're creating this content for are not able to access it because they don't have the money. But they also said that they were using some of this as like a sex education type of scenario, and the women's health article did give a ton of sites listed, which I was really impressed by. I thought it was going to be like 2 sites just to say that they did. I didn't look any of them up, but I thought the way they presented the information was really good, because they like gave the name of the site, gave like the URL link, and then they gave like some of the defining features. And I would say I would link that for you in the description, but I don't really want to encourage porn usage. But so I'll have to think on that. Because I mean, I feel like porn users are going to use porn whether you promote it or not. And at least these are ethical. No, I can't convince myself to do it. Sorry, guys. But women's health article, ethical porn. You can look it up yourselves if you're that enthralled with the concept. But so that is it for week 3. Week 4 is next. And week 4, we talk about anatomy. And it was cool. Anatomy week was cool. So I will let you guys know about that. But what did my screen just do? That was wild. In the meantime, like, subscribe, notification bell, all that jazz. And I will see you next time, guys. Bye.